Good afternoon, everyone. I said good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, thank you. Before we begin, please know that we'll be discussing heavy topics, including gun violence and the stories of survivors. Please take this moment to ensure you are comfortable by listening and being here. Now, a moment of silence to all the lives that have been lost due to gun violence. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my fellow Americans, the Constitution declares that the President of the United States shall give Congress information about the state of our union. This afternoon, young people and family members directly impacted by all forms of gun violence have come together to tell you that the state of our union's gun violence crisis remains dangerous. Today, we are here to demand that you live up to the campaign promises and support and invest all Americans closest to the trauma and pain of gun violence, and pass life-saving legislation to ensure this year we help build safe and just communities for all of us. My name is Doud Mumman, and I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. Growing up, my parents instilled in me the values of community and service. And just like any other kid, I had big dreams on how to make that a reality. I wanted to become a surgeon to save one life at a time, and because of a lot of Grey's Anatomy. But at the age of 14, my life was forever altered when I was called into my community to help fight the public health crisis of gun violence in America. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, particularly Senators Mitt Romney and Mike Lee, I'm not the only young person who was robbed of their childhood because you have refused to end gun violence. I'm not the only young person who was forced to take a different path in life because someone I love was impacted by gun violence. I'm not the only young person who has had to put their life on hold because you have failed to do your job. 3 million American children. 3 million American children each year will lose their innocence because they have witnessed or seen some form of gun violence during their childhoods. With every loud bang, every loud noise, every police siren, young people will duck for cover, search for the nearest exits, or put both hands in the air, wondering if they'll become the latest casualty of America's public health crisis. Black children in particular learn about the dangers of firearms way too early because everyday gun violence is a symptom of much larger societal challenges that disproportionately impact the communities that our country has left far behind. The 7 bullets shot into Jacob Blake's back by an officer of the Kenosha Police Department was witnessed by 3 of his children. When asked what he said in those moments, he told them, "Daddy loves you no matter what," because he thought it would be the last thing he would ever say to them. While only one of many stories, this shows the harrowing pervasiveness of gun violence that leaves no neighborhood, no zip code, and no community untouched. In America, we prioritize access to firearm over access to basic human needs. Far too many Americans, guns are easier to obtain than housing, medical care, education, or even food. Don't our leaders understand that people who are part of loving and thriving communities don't turn to guns? Don't they see that to tackle gun violence in all of its form, we not only have to understand and liberate ourselves from the root causes of gun violence, but also empower and enable communities to ensure that they are architects of their own solutions. We are here today to deliver a State of the Union on gun violence that forces you to listen to the stories, the strategies, and to the relentless commitment from the young people and families all across the country impacted by this crisis. And we are not going anywhere until you do your job.
Good afternoon. It's quite windy. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, particularly Senators Blumenthal and Murphy, my name is Jackson Middlemen, and I was born and raised in Newtown, Connecticut. I was in 6th grade when a shooter used a military-style assault weapon to murder 26 students and educators at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And I have seen firsthand how gun violence forever changes families, destroys communities, and how it obliterates our sense of security and safety. Members of Congress, your failure to end gun violence has forced an entire generation of kids to grow up with anxiety, depression, and fear. It has created a country in which too many Americans respond to the pandemic by rushing out and purchasing guns, putting themselves and their loved ones at greater risk of injury or death. You have allowed firearms to proliferate and ensured that shootings are everyday and ever more deadly occurrences. Our nation experienced at least 159 mass shootings in the first 118 days of 2021, a number that will only increase as our country continues to lift COVID-19 restrictions and Americans begin to gather in larger groups. It's frustrating for young people and our families to live this reality year after year and to hear the same old argument around shall not be infringed. Well, what about our right? Our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What about our right to live free of fear and anxiety? Members of Congress, you have allowed the firearms industry to purposely market weapons of war to young, impressionable men and perpetuate the toxic notion that owning a device designed to end life helps you grow into your manhood. You have allowed the industry to build up an entire masculine, white-centric, grievance-fueled identity around the gun to market its firearms to the young men who are most likely to carry out the kind of mass shooting my community is all too familiar with. It's no wonder then that the United States is home to just 4% of the world's population, but owns 40% of the guns in civilian hands? Or that Americans are 25 times more likely to be shot and killed than people living in pure nations around the world? Despite the industry's propaganda, we know that where there are more guns, there are more gun injuries and deaths. I learned that lesson the hard way on December 14th, 2012. That day taught me that if you want something done, you're going to need to have to get involved and do it yourself. Since the age of 12, I've been organizing rallies and events, lobbying trips and die-ins, school walkouts and candlelight vigils. My high school years were defined by my efforts to reduce gun deaths in our country, and I saturate myself in this work to help cope with the tragedy of the Sandy Hook shooting and all of the senseless and preventable gun injuries and deaths that have followed since then. I'm now 19 years old. I live in Washington, D.C. I work for my senator, and I'm looking forward to a career in government. And so I'm here today to send a clear message to our national leaders. I will not stop fighting for expanded background checks, a ban on military-style weapons, for investments in the communities closest to the pain of interpersonal gun violence, until you live up to the promises you made us and pass life-saving reforms that will actually keep us safe. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my name is Kate Ranta, and I'm a domestic violence survivor. Several years ago, my ex-husband stalked me to my apartment in Parkland, Florida, loaded a Beretta 9mm with hollow point bullets, and shot directly at the door behind which my father and I were standing. The bullets from my ex-husband's gun penetrated the door, and he pushed his way into the apartment. He walked over to my father and shot him point blank in his side. I heard my father grunt, and I thought he had died. My ex-husband shot me twice, and I remember crawling in my own blood on the floor, screaming and begging for my life. I could literally feel the cold settle in. I could feel myself dying. To make matters even worse, my father and I were not the only people in that apartment that night. My then 4-year-old son, William, was there as well, and he had witnessed everything. He was jumping up and down and screaming, trying to get his father to stop. "Don't do it, Daddy, don't shoot Mommy," he yelled. Eventually, the shooting stopped, and my father, my son, and I escaped the apartment alive by some miracle. A year before this tragedy, I had done what domestic abuse survivors are always told to do. I took my son and I left my abusive husband. I just left. I felt scared of him. He had served in the Air Force and kept multiple firearms in our house. I took out a restraining order to keep him as far away as possible. But when he was served the temporary restraining order, the police said that they could remove the guns that were in the home, but they couldn't stop him from going out the next day and buying another gun. And that's exactly what he did. He bought that Beretta, he Googled husband shooting wife, and then he went out and tried to kill us. The truth is, federal law fails to protect women from armed domestic abusers. Current or former boyfriends, for instance, who have been convicted of a domestic violence crime but have no children with their current partner and do not live with that partner, are still permitted to own a firearm. Also, individuals who are convicted of a misdemeanor stalking can also get a gun. But we know that a gun in the home during a domestic violence situation increases by 500%, 500% the probability that the man will murder her, or that he will at least use the weapon to threaten her. In states where firearms are more widely available, women, like their male counterparts, have higher rates of suicide, homicide, and unintentional gun deaths. African American women bear the brunt of this danger. They are 3 times as likely to die from a gun as a white woman, and are twice as likely to be fatally shot by an intimate partner compared to white women. 4.5 million women say that an intimate partner threatened them with a firearm, an astonishing statistic. In fact, 554 American women are shot and killed by their romantic partners every single year, on average. That's a death every 16 hours. Their deaths are on the hands of lawmakers who have failed to act. Our leaders must close these dangerous loopholes and pass laws that will make guns harder to get. And I know I won't stop fighting until they do. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my name is Kristen Song. When my beautiful boy, Ethan, was placed in my arms, I stared into his eyes and I made him a promise. I promised him that I would protect him and keep him safe always, that I would lay down my life for him. Did you make that same promise to your children? On January 31st, 2018, Ethan walked out of our home and out of our lives. He walked to his best friend's house where, unbeknownst to me, the father had 3 unsecured guns and ammunition stored in a shoebox. That was the father's gun safe, a shoebox. Ethan was shot in the head. The ER doctor told me he was unrecognizable, even to my eyes. I was the first to welcome him into this world, and I wanted to be the last to say goodbye, to whisper how sorry I am that I broke my promise to him, that I failed him as a mother. I wanted to kiss his forehead, hold his hand, and tuck him in one last time. Instead, I walked out of the hospital while my beautiful boy was being wheeled to the morgue. Losing a child is like holding your hand over a hot flame. It's unrelenting agony. Grief does not take a holiday. There is no hump day, no TGI Fridays, You cannot outrun it, and you cannot hide. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death in children 0 to 19, with Black and brown children experiencing a disproportionate impact from the nation's gun violence crisis. What that means is that your child has a higher chance of being killed by a gun than any other danger facing them. And just because you are careful with your guns does not mean your neighbor is. Does that scare you? It should terrify you. We are at war, but not with a foreign country. With your inaction, Americans leaders, you are waging war on us. This war is killing our children, mothers, fathers, our police. A bullet is an equal opportunist. It does not see political parties, race, religion, rich, poor, occupation, gender. It just sees death. We are the casualties of this war. We talk about statistics a lot, and they are important, but please do not forget that behind every statistic, there is a dead child, a broken mother, and a shattered community. And there, before the grace of God, go you. If you have not been touched by gun violence, you have gotten lucky so far. Life-saving legislation like Ethan's Law, which requires households with children under the age of 18 to lock up firearms, background checks, closing the Charleston loophole. Yes, it may be inconvenient for a gun owner. It may take you a couple of minutes just to secure your weapon, fill out some paperwork, and wait to hear back from the FBI. But I would argue that it is much more inconvenient to watch the coroner zip down a body bag and ask, "Is this your beautiful child?" To sit in your child's empty bedroom trying to find the words for their eulogy and watch your child that just days before, who was full of life, be lowered into the ground. I wanted to thank our leaders for their thoughts and prayers, but I want to be very clear. The survivors want action, and we want it now. If your house is on fire, would thoughts and prayers alone put out the fire? Of course not. America, our house is on fire. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of the Congress. My name is Simran Chawla. I come here today to address you as a survivor of gun violence, as someone who has survived a mass shooting, as someone who saw people die from gunshot wounds before my very eyes. It's something that I still think about and something that I will never forget. But I am also here today as a young Hindu woman of color and as Eric's friend. Eric and I met at the end of my freshman year of high school. We were almost complete opposites. Eric was an exceptionally talented dancer and a brilliant singer. Meanwhile, I did not have a single creative bone in my body. But somehow we still worked. He was loud, and I was very quiet. He was outgoing, and I was one of the biggest introverts you would ever meet. He was a boy who fought against all the injustice in the world, and I was the girl who watched him do it. When I became a high school senior, Eric headed off to college at the American Musical and Dramatic Academy. I can still remember the moment when I heard the news. It was shortly after my second period, and I was in choir, surrounded by the people who knew him and the people who loved him. Our vice principal came in to tell us that Eric had passed away, that it was a suicide. And the entire community, that artistic, creative group that Eric helped nurture, was in complete shock. Many of my fellow students gave up their pursuits of the arts altogether shortly after his death, their lives forever changed by a preventable tragedy. We knew that Eric had struggled with his identity, but we never dared imagine the worst. Eric always used his voice to advocate for change, but he's no longer here to tell his story. And although he is gone, his story still inspires people to continue fighting. my advocacy started for Eric. I never would have had the courage or the fortitude to use my platform if it was not for the memories of his passion and his fearlessness. It breaks my heart to say that Eric's story is far from unique. Bigotry kills, hate kills, and unfortunately, the availability of firearms in America ensures that suicides are more often successful than not. In America, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people suffer from particularly high suicide rates. Between 10 to 20% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people will try to commit suicide over the course of their lives. In 2015, research found a staggering 40% of high school students who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or questioning their orientation seriously contemplated suicide. Almost 25% had actually attempted it. For transgender people, the numbers are even higher. 41% say that they have tried to kill themselves at some point. Black trans women are in particular danger of gun violence as they live at the intersection of racism, transphobia, homophobia, and sexism, and they face discrimination and prejudice on multiple fronts. This year alone, at least 10 Black trans women have been killed. And so it is my own painful experience with gun violence, Eric's story, and similar stories from every corner of our country that drove me to fight for the health, well-being, and safety of our shared community, just like Eric would have if he still had a voice. I became a leader in the Team Enough and March for Our Lives DC Youth Lobbying Collective, lobbying lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to do their part in building safer communities, and I'm now one of the co-state directors for March for Our Lives DC. As a young person who has had their life turned upside down by firearms, I'm demanding that our leaders prioritize me. I'm demanding that our leaders prioritize my friends. And I'm demanding that our leaders prioritize our community. The time is now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my fellow Americans. My name is Poe Murray. Over 8 years ago, my neighbor entered an elementary school carrying a military-style weapon and killed 20 children and 6 educators in less than 5 minutes. This tragedy pushed me to establish the Newtown Action Alliance and to advocate for a set of bold legislative changes, including a ban on weapons of war. But I come before you this afternoon, not as a leader of a national gun violence prevention organization. I am addressing you as a Korean American who immigrated from South Korea to Barre, Vermont with her family at the age of 9. Our family settled in this mostly white community, and I can still remember children mocking me for looking different. In an effort to fit in, I permed my hair and I distanced myself from my culture. Racism followed me through adolescence and into adulthood. I was the only Asian American in my high school class and one of the very few Asian Americans at University of Vermont. I still hear Asian jokes, and believe me, us Asian Americans have long stopped laughing. Instead, we've had to spend our lifetime dealing with the damaging myth of the model minority. And Asian women in particular have had to confront over-sexualization within the dominant American culture. In fact, when I travel outside of my community, people make assumptions about who I am and where I am from. Despite the fact that I became an American citizen and lived in the United States for more than 45 years, I am not seen as an American. I am seen as an outsider or a foreigner who looks different. When I brought my young biracial children to a playground in an affluent community in Connecticut, I was asked if I were my children's nanny. In 2020, things got worse for people who look like me. As COVID-19 began to spread across the country, the former president and his supporters falsely and purposefully blamed the Chinese people for spreading the coronavirus to shift attention away from their failure to adequately address the pandemic. As a result, violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders skyrocketed by 149% in 16 major US cities, and most recently resulted in the deaths of 8 people, including 6 Asian women, in a mass shooting incident in Atlanta, Georgia. Throughout my years advocating for gun violence prevention, I never saw our issue through the lens of an Asian American. But the Atlanta shooting reminded me that hate and easy access to incredibly powerful weapons is a deadly combination, and no American community or an ethnic group are immune to the gun violence crisis in our nation. Violent extremists and hate criminals often use guns as a tool to threaten and intimidate members of historically marginalized communities, and in doing so, inflict serious harm. Every year, 10,000 people are victims of hate crimes, and some reports indicate that one hate crime occurs every 2 minutes and 20 seconds in America. As we know all too well, in a country where guns are readily and easily available, conflicts often escalate and turn deadly. That's why the president and Congress must work together now to strengthen our background check system, ban military-style weapons and high-capacity magazines, pass extreme risks protection order laws, restrict firearms at protests and demonstrations, require permits to purchase firearms, set the federal standards for safe storage of firearms, and disarm hate by prohibiting people who have been convicted of misdemeanors, hate crimes from acquiring firearms. The time is now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Andrew Brown, Micaiah Bryant, Dante Wright, Rayshard Brooks, George Perry Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Stephon Clark, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Walter Scott, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and the 1,491 other Black Americans shot and killed by police since June of 2015. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my name is Yasmin Mabin, and I am here today because none of those Americans could be. They were killed by the state while being Black in America. When I was younger, watching all of this unfold on the news with my family, I was certain that police officers who place so little value in Black life that they didn't think twice before killing us would be held accountable by a government that holds itself to lofty ideals. I was wrong. But by college, I knew better. I'll never forget when my mom was driving home with my sister and me home from her sister's school. Suddenly, there's sirens blaring from behind. My mom pulls over and my sister begins to freak out. She's shaking, she's imagining the worst scenario possible. My mom talks to the officer. Her taillight is out, and the officer leaves without incident, but my sister is still shaking. My mom sits in the car for a while trying to calm her down, telling her not to worry, that everything's going to be all right. But like me, my sister knows better. I'm here today to make sure that you know better too. I'm here to tell you that police violence is gun violence. I'm here to tell you that police violence underscores the reality
that firearms, even in the hands of well-trained professionals tasked with protecting our communities, are still dangerous. As we work to ensure that our public safety budgets reflect the value of all Americans and invest fully in Black and Brown communities, we must stop resorting to violence to confront challenges that are rooted in inequality, poverty, and poor access to the very basic essentials necessary for life. Firearms combined with implicit bias and racism result in state-sanctioned murder, particularly for Americans who look like me and for our Latinx and Indigenous families. Our leaders need to treat gun violence as a public health issue and enact policy changes that provide resources for communities disproportionately affected by gun violence. They need to move away from the criminalization that's been happening in our communities for far too long. President Biden has used his executive authority to invest in community-based programs, and he's committed to spending an additional $5 billion on evidence-based community violence intervention initiatives. The time is now for Senate Majority Leader and the House and the Senate to pass the president's request. I know that my very life may depend on it.
Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress. My name is Anthony David, and I am a native Washingtonian and Team Enough Executive Council member. You tell me we live in a democracy, but yet all my life I've lived in a district rather than a state, paid taxes to a government in which I have no direct representation in, and experienced gun violence without ever being able to vote for lawmakers who can end it. I've seen militarized police officers in my city routinely harass and attack peaceful protesters who are simply exercising their First Amendment rights to resist systemic racism and injustices. Yet those same police officers stood back as white supremacists and militia members bragged about bringing dangerous firearms into our city, posted pictures of tunnels under our Capitol building all over the internet, and warned you that Congress itself is the target. Based on these actions, citizens across the districts are asking, who does MPD really protect? Why is it that the voices seeking to use their guns and their ammunition to overturn and destroy our very democratic system have more rights than I do? Why is it that their violent, aberrant, anti-democratic behavior is given a pass? Why is it that you continue to allow such voices to easily and readily stockpile firearms and ammunition, but look the other way as Americans, particularly communities of color, struggle under the public health crisis that those weapons create? You choose national inaction even as our nation's capital experienced the highest number of homicides in almost 2 decades, as cities across the country live through double-digit increases as well. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, you tell me we live in a democracy, yet you refuse to give people like me a voice in shaping my future here in the city, and you refuse to confront the armed white supremacists who threaten it. I demand the right to fair representation in order to strengthen our union by making my home, Washington, D.C., the 51st state. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my name is Gregory Jackson. On April 21st, 2013, I joined this movement not by choice, but by circumstance. 1.2 miles that direction from Congress, I was shot down while walking home. And when that bullet hit me, I was raced to the hospital, literally bleeding to death. And I wasn't met by my nurses. I wasn't met by my surgeon. I was met by police officers that criminalized me as I was fighting for my death, for my life, excuse me. When I had a chance to actually speak to my doctor after getting past those 3 investigators, I was told I only had 26 minutes left to live, and there was still a chance that I would not make it. Sorry, y'all. Thankfully, I survived that day. And after 6 months, 21 days in the hospital, 6 different surgeries, sitting next to my parents, my family, my friends, and watching them experience that trauma with me, I was able to make it out of that and get back to this new form of reality. And when you hear my story, you would think that this is common. But unfortunately, should not be common. In America, gun violence has become the #1 cause of death for Black men, for Black youth, the #2 cause of death for Black women, for Latino men. And ever since that fateful day for me on April 21st in 2013, over 800,000 people have been impacted by this crisis. People like Micaiah Wilson, who was walking out her door to get ice cream and was shot down. Karan Brown, one of my mentees, who was shot at a McDonald's. Devon McNeil, who was shot 1 block behind my house at a cookout on the 4th of July. These are our children, and they are dying. And since then, we have seen zero action from Congress. When I was in the hospital 3 days after the Senate failed to pass anything around background checks, and since then, they've ignored this issue and looked at it as just a hot button issue. Devon, Karan, Micaiah all died within walking distance of this building. While many tourists come here to tour this building, people like me drive through ambulances past it fighting for our lives. And it's not simply about the lives either, it's about the money. Every year, we lose over $280 billion to gun violence. Since I was shot, that means $1.6 trillion our economy has lost to gun violence. So if Republicans really care about their budgets, they really care about saving the dollar, then they should start with saving our lives and ending this crisis of gun violence. On December 20th, President Biden stated that this is a public health crisis. And for every public health crisis that we've seen in America, it's been responded with policy, with accountability, and with investment. President Trump invested $9 billion into the opioid crisis. And Senate had nothing to say about that. So we are standing here asking for not only legislation, but investment in the public health solutions that we know work. President Biden, in his American Jobs Plan, committed $5 billion to invest in community-based solutions, evidence-based solutions, solutions that we know work, solutions that in cities like Oakland, in Richmond, in New York, in Queens, in Atlanta, in Maryland, in DC, in Baltimore, have proven to save lives. In some cities, they've been able to reduce gun violence by upwards of 80%. There's no need for research or data. What's needed is investment in these solutions. The president has stepped up and said, I want to see $5 billion in my plan. I want to see dollars in my fiscal year 22 budget. And since then, the House and the Senate has moved forward on every other crisis except for this one. So we stand here demanding change, but most importantly, demanding real investment in resources and support in strategies that we know work and that can save lives. We stand here saying the time is now. But for Micaiah, for Karan, for Devon, their time has passed. So how many more youth will we lose before we recognize that the time is now to take action? So we stand here demanding action, demanding investment, but most importantly, demanding you to step up. Step up for us, step up for our families, and step up for our future. Thank you.
I want to say happy Thursday. Happy Thursday. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my fellow resilient Washingtonians. My name is Tia Bell, And I wish to start the biggest moment in my life with a moment of gratitude, thanking each and every one of you for your hearts and your ears. As I feel the most powerful today in this fight to end gun violence. As a native Washingtonian, I've never felt this powerful. In this walk, in this journey, I felt powerless. I've had doors closed, but today is my moment. It's our moment. I was born right here in Northwest DC in 1989 in our nation's capital, the Howard University Howard Hospital to be exact. Then the state of gun violence in our nation's capital was peaking, averaging over 400 homicides a year for more than 12 years straight, and normally being referred to as the murder capital of the world. As much as I heard the sounds of go-go, I heard the sounds of gunshots. Yes, we were the chocolate city, which was rich in culture, distinct in dialect, and known to thrive. But our communities were infested with guns, with drugs, with despair, and with a lack of opportunity. As a result, unfortunately, we have been bred and wired to only survive and use a gun as our source of as a problem solver. Being born to a teenage mom who's with me today, being born to a teenage mommy dealing with her own adverse childhood experiences exposed me to a lot of pain, but also led me to my purpose that I stand in today. I was just 10 years old when my mom was shot twice in broad daylight as a result of interpersonal gun violence and neighborhood beef. At this time, I was too a product of my environment, failing to realize the infectious disease of gun violence was already prevalent in my home and in my community. It was not until I was 17 years old, after losing my stepfather, Christopher Morris, losing more friends and family than I can count. God bless Riri, Tilly, Ali, Rat, Shy, and everybody that I can't think the name right now. And then in losing my Uncle Doug, that I realized this cultural norm of gun violence was an obsession of ours, a way of impulse to respond to the everyday conflict. In this moment, gun violence became my problem. Youth violence is an urgent U.S. public health priority, and firearm violence in particular has reached epidemic proportions. Black youth accounted for 35% of all firearm-related deaths among young people in 2019, despite making up only 2%. These disparities are a reflection of the historical structures and ongoing racism that my Black youth and families face. Gun violence is, of course, the source of everyone's pain. I stand in with each and every one of you. I wanted to hug each and every one of you after you spoke. It's the source of our pain and also our tragedy. But gun violence in my community is a symptom of 400 years of neglect. Interpersonal gun violence, not everyday gun violence, not city gun violence, not community gun violence, but interpersonal gun violence is particularly concentrated in inner cities and homes that have experienced the legacy of severe racial segregation, redlining, and other economic disinvestment. These structural factors are at the root of all forms of violence, and especially interpersonal gun violence. This disinvestment in urban communities of color strongly are associated with the lack of prevention. Can I hear you say prevention? Thank you. Our words become our actions. It's associated with the lack of prevention-focused youth programs and services in these settings and in our settings. Many researchers have highlighted an urgent need for evidence-based prevention programs to reduce gun violence, and especially firearm-related morbidity and mortality among Black youth. Yet, we have very few primary prevention interventions that work on multiple levels to comprehensively address these risk factors. Even fewer address the root causes of violence in community and structural levels. The beauty is that this very voice that you hear and this very Black girl magic that you see is the proof I am the proof that this deadly cycle can end. I am the product of prevention. I founded the True Reasons I Grab a Gun Evolved from Risk Project, the Trigger Project, a youth-led organization intersecting public health, social justice, and positive youth development. I've witnessed hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of my youth that I've directly and indirectly impacted in gun violence within. Trigger lives to end gun violence through addressing the root causes of gun violence while simultaneously raising awareness about the risk and protective factors that the CDC has linked to youth violence. Look it up. We work with inadequate funding to counter the toxic stress, chronic trauma that our city and youth experience in their daily lives, that I still experience in my daily life. We work to make young people feel safe, and we create evidence-based programs that help connect new brain neurons and become more productive citizens. The gun in our nation's capital, unfortunately, provides a sense of safety and identity to the young people that I serve. But it also leads to Black girls, boys, men, and women going to be handcuffed or thrown in a casket. Our goal is to replace the school to prison pipeline with a pipeline to promise for more Black presidents and Madam Presidents, more researchers, more Black news analysts, law enforcement, social workers, trauma doctors, and you name it. More Black founders. Our youth are the solution and must be empowered to create and design solutions of holistic healing and civic contribution for their peers. Right, March for Our Lives? We have to rely on communities most harmed by gun violence to design preventative solutions. We need to embody the voice of the voiceless. We need our Congress to come together as one. The time is now to be prevention. We can end and prevent gun violence. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sandy Phillips. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress. My husband and I, Lonnie, had our daughter Jessie taken from us in the theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, almost 9 years ago in 2012. Jessie was vivacious, witty, compassionate, a young lady poised just on the cusp of what everyone says would be a great future as a sports journalist. Jessie was also a fan of the Batman movies and was absolutely determined to see The Dark Knight Rises on the day it came out. On that night, as our daughter was sitting in Theater 9, a man was sitting in the front row. He got up, walked out through the emergency exit, and returned in tactical clothing and retrieved his weapons from the trunk of his car. He had an AR-15, a shotgun, high velocity 223 bullets. One of the 6 bullets that killed her slammed through a seat, entered her left orbital, and left a 5-inch hole in the side of her face as it blew her brains out onto the theater floor and onto her companion. The other 5 bullets tumbled when they tore through her flesh and devastated both her legs,
America's public health crisis of gun violence devastated us when a killer exploited our nation's lax gun laws and killed our daughter with a weapon that belongs on a battlefield, not in civilized society. We are beyond waiting for lawmakers to live up to their promises. President Joe Biden, during your campaign, you promised to send a bill to Congress repealing PLACA on your very first day in office. We are here to make sure that you work with the Senate Majority Leader to find a viable path forward to repeal PLACA. Invest in the communities most impacted by gun violence and strengthen our gun laws after our daughter's murder. We have dedicated our lives to helping other survivors of gun violence. We founded Survivors Empowered, an organization focused on helping communities impacted by gun violence navigate the first few days, weeks, months, and years of surviving. We are doing our part to build safer communities every single day. Our leaders cannot waste another day waiting to do theirs. Let's get this done.
Good afternoon, everyone. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, particularly Senator Rubio and Scott, and why not Congressman Matt Gaetz? He might remember me. Just in case, my name is Manuel Oliver, and I am Joaquin Oliver's dad. And I lost my beautiful son on Valentine's Day in 2018. A little more than a year ago, leaders from all over the world, including the President of the United States, found about this very dangerous pandemic that was hitting the planet. During this early stage of panic, different theories came out. It will get worse. This is just the beginning, or even one day is like a miracle, will disappear. As Americans, we don't usually follow instructions or protocols from foreign countries. Still, because people were dying daily, we made an exception and started listening, watching, and learning from others. For the first time, I saw our country paying attention to what other nations were doing to fight back against the mystery behind COVID-19. Eventually, the federal government, private industry, and almost every aspect of society prioritized this crisis and took concrete steps to help stop the spread of COVID-19. They urge Americans to stay at home, wear a mask, and socially distance in order to save lives. Scientists work hard to find a vaccine. States pass restrictions to help keep us safe, and the federal government sent stimulus checks to help Americans most impacted by the pandemic. The fact is that we decided to work together. And because of that, we found the cure. We developed not one vaccine, but 3. We followed safety protocols and social distancing guidelines. We saw campaigns sharing the importance of the vaccine and how taking care of ourselves will also mean taking care of others. We made significant sacrifice to get back to a normal state of living and enjoying life. Today, we can say that when we combine our efforts and care for others, we can accomplish big things. But we must understand that gun violence is a pandemic born and raised in America. This time, we don't have no one else to blame but ourselves. So, how come after more than 1.8 million Americans have lost their lives because of gun violence since the 1960s, we haven't seen the federal government prioritizing saving the lives of American citizens and addressing the suffering of more than 40,000 families every year after losing their loved ones? How come we don't see anyone working on a gun violence pandemic vaccine based on common sense gun regulations that will prevent tragedies like the one that ended the life of my beautiful son, Joaquin "Wack" Oliver? This pandemic requires more than a mask and social distance. 6 feet won't be enough, considering that an AR-15 can hit you from 1,500 feet away. For years, the world has witnessed how American leaders fail. Leaders from other nations can see the corrupt relationship between Capitol Hill and the gun industry and how they have been manipulating our society with the false idea of gun rights freedom. We demand that the White House and Congress understand that when it comes to saving lives, the time is now. Le demandamos a la Casa Blanca, al Congreso y al Senado que entiendan que cuando se trata de salvar vidas, el momento es ahora. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my name is Maisha Fields, and I'm a part of a club that no one wants to join. I'm not talking about going to Costco or going to the nearest gym in your community or even be getting 3 cents or 5 cents off when you go to the gas station or you need a discount on your oatmeal. I'm a part of a club that none of us ever wanted to join. I remember when I got my first membership application that I didn't fill out. I was sitting in the dentist's office about to get a root canal when my brother called and he said, "Someone just threatened my life. They've been following me. They showed up at my job. They showed up outside of my house. And everywhere I go, they're there. And they said, I am going to kill you." I said to my brother, "Get on a plane right now. Here's my credit card number. Get on a plane and come to Colorado." Unfortunately, before I got out the dental chair, I had learned that my brother, Javad Marshall Fields, and his beautiful fiance, Vivian Wolf, were gunned down at a streetlight with assault weapons 15 days after he graduated from college. Members of Congress, the club I'm in, the club that all of us are in, it changes you. It changes everything about you. It changes your marriage. It changes your relationship with your children. It changes whether or not you even want to get up and go to work, comb your hair, or take a shower. Nothing is ever the same. As a matter of fact, we have to look to redefine normal in our lives. One thing that did happen, though, when I lost Javad and we lost Vivian, I had a new sense of purpose. It pushed me to fight for the elimination of gun violence, to make this the public health issue that we can solve in this lifetime. And I realized that we cannot change what we are not willing to confront. So together, my mother and I, who's now a senator, Senator Ranta Fields, who was the first Black woman to ever be elected into office, we fought to pass the most comprehensive gun package to make sure that no mother or father ever has to bury their children. Through our experience in the Survivors Club, we learned that some survivors of gun violence are the most courageous leaders in the world. After all, we've lost it all, and we're willing to fight. And we know that when we fight, we win. We have seen the closest people to us be lost. We're not here to make friends. And I really am not interested in being popular. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll do whatever is necessary to make sure that we pass comprehensive gun legislation in this lifetime. The success we had in Colorado should serve as a role model for federal lawmakers. It should serve as an example and a template for what we can do on a federal level and what we can even reach way, way, way beyond. But we'll only be successful if we activate the members of this club. We've all been affected by gun violence. Survivors must have a seat at the table. Because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I'm encouraging every survivor, if you show up to a room and there's not a seat for you, go get a chair. We have the power to end this epidemic, because when we fight, we win. And as I close, I want everyone to say, when we fight, we're going to win.
Well, damn. Wow. I want to give all a round of applause to the powerful people that we just heard from today. I lost my father a month ago to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the pain is never ending. It's only been a month, and these people have grieved for lifetimes, for far too long than anyone should. And for them to have the courage to come up here and tell you their stories, for you to not believe that they're just statistics, but people that have lost loved ones, family members, children, partners. This epidemic is not going anywhere until we stand up and fight back, until we stand up and do the work, because when we fight, so Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, members of Congress, as you heard this afternoon, the state of our union's gun violence epidemic remains dangerous. But the national movement to end this public health epidemic is stronger than it has ever been. As you heard from our powerful speakers, your failure to address the public health crisis of gun violence in America and your choice to do so little in the face of so much injury and death is devastating young families and people across the country. Inaction is undermining our futures. Inaction is leaving children parentless. Inaction is leaving parents childless and destroying entire communities of people. So here is the daunting yet achievable reality at hand. We are in a fight to create a world that has never existed. A world free of gun violence. A world where the millions of lives are not stolen or forever changed. A world where 121,294,294 people in their lifetimes never experienced the pain and suffering that we have heard about today. A world where we not only dream and believe, but work to make history until gun violence is history. We demand that those that we have elected to office do their part to address gun violence in all of its forms. You work for us. And we expect to live up to the campaign promises you've made for us because we are not going fucking anywhere. But here's my greatest hope, is that everyone listening today continues to join us in pressuring this administration and your elected members of Congress, and to continue fighting this fight even beyond that every single day. Because I know one thing for certain, that the state of our movement is stronger than ever, and that this is a fight that we can and will win.